Well, hello. This is devotion is for Monday, the 17th of October. And today we are going to be reading in Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 36. Before we read those, I just want to kind of give a little background. In the first 17 verses, we're introduced to Joseph. Joseph was Israel, Jacob. It was his son that was born to him when he was old. And what we look at in the first 17 verses is that Israel, he favored this boy. When he was a teenager, he made him this coat of many colors, and the other brothers were jealous of him because their father favored him so. And Joseph had a couple of dreams. He dreamed that they were out cutting wheat in the field and binding them up into sheaves, bundles, and his bundle stood up and the other 11 bowed down to his. So the brothers are like, "What? You think you're going to rule over us?" And then he had another dream that the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. So the father is like, "What? Your mother and I and your 11 brothers are going to bow down and worship you?" He rebuked him for that. Well, then his brothers went off to tend the flocks, and Israel sends Joseph to go check on them and to come back and bring word. And that's where we pick up in this account in verse 18 of Genesis 37. So I'll go ahead and read. It says, and when they saw him afar off, talking about Joseph's brothers, even before he came to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." So, so it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. When they lifted their eyes and looked, there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit. And he tore his clothes. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?" So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid, a goat, of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him." Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Oh, you know, we live in such a broken world, don't we? I mean, Joseph, did he choose to be the youngest? Did he choose to be favored of his father? Did he choose his dreams? You know, God was speaking to him in those dreams, prophesying in a way, because he told him what was going to happen. So as we look at Joseph, it was sort of predestined what he was to do. And yet he was persecuted by his brothers. He was sold, betrayed by his brothers. And he suffered at the hands of his brothers. Now, as we look at the life of Joseph this week, as we move into the week, I will do my best to try to allude to all of the comparisons of Joseph to Jesus Christ. In many ways, he's almost like an Old Testament picture of Christ. But as we just look at what we've just read, and as I told you, in light of the first 17 verses of this chapter, just kind of a synopsis of that, we see a young man who is sent by his fathers to his brethren. He's sent by his father to his brethren. And when they see him, they mistreat him. They threaten to kill him. They would have killed him if Reuben hadn't interceded. And so that's one similarity. Jesus, think of John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I mentioned in my sermon this morning in John chapter 9, we look back at chapter 8, because in John chapter 9, Jesus did a miracle where he anointed a man's eyes who had been blind from birth. He anointed them with a mixture of spit and clay. He spat on the ground and made a clay out of the dust of the ground, anointed the man's eyes and said, "Go wash your eyes off in the pool of Siloam," which being interpreted means sent. And I thought it was really interesting that when we go back to chapter 8, just the previous passage to that miracle, Jesus mentions, as he's talking to the Pharisees, and he's saying, "Listen, I'm the one who's been sent by the Father. I'm the one who's been sent by the Father, but you don't want to listen." And then he tells the man to go wash his eyes off in the pool, a specific place. He didn't say just go to any place to get water. Go to the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And it's a picture of the fact that we need to be cleansed by the one whom the Father sent. I love it. I love it. it's just so powerful to understand that God has a plan. God had a plan from the very beginning. And that is, if we want to receive spiritual sight, if we want to have the blinders lifted off, we need to come to Jesus. We need to be washed by the one whom the Father sent, Jesus Christ. And now we see Joseph has been sent by his father to his brethren to check on them. And they deal terribly toward him. They sell him into slavery, make up this ruse by dipping his tunic that his father had made for him of many colors in blood, and then going back and telling their father that, oh, the boy's been devoured by wild animals. Broke their father's heart. I mean, how cruel. All because of their jealousy. And so let's just quickly apply the specs for a minute as we see this. What are the things we see? S, is there any sin for us to forsake? P, is there any promise to claim or principle to apply? E, is there any example to learn from? C, is there any command for us to obey? T, is there anything to be thankful for? So the first letter is the letter S. Is there any sin here for us to forsake? What are the sins that are mentioned here? You see the sin of jealousy. You see the sin of murder. Now, they didn't commit murder, but it was in their heart. Jesus said, if you have hatred in your heart, you've committed murder in your heart already. So there's the sin of jealousy. There's the sin of hatred, murder. There's the sin of deceit. They deceive their father. There's the sin of lying. Those are two, basically the same thing. They lied with the intent to deceive their father. We're not even going to get into the whole issue of slavery, but I mean, it's there, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of implications here. If we're guilty of any of those things, we need to ask God to forgive us. You know, God has revealed these things in His Word. Obviously, these were sinful behaviors, and if they apply to us, we need to repent and ask God to forgive us. What about principles to apply or promises to claim? Well, there's a principle here that I think that applies to parenting, and that is, you know, the Bible says that God is no respecter of persons. And I think that as parents, we need to be careful. We need to be careful. If you have children or even grandchildren, we need to be careful not to show favoritism, one child over another. It's difficult, you know, especially if you have a child who's rebellious, or you have a child that is a people pleaser and just wants to be please you, and then one that's, you know, independent minded. Yeah, you reward good behavior, and that's as we should, but we have to love equally, and it's sometimes a challenge. So maybe there's a principle there, and maybe some of the problems that the 11 brothers had with Joseph was because their father showed favoritism. That to me, that would be a sin as a father, as a grandfather, that I'd want to be careful. But what else is there? I'm sure we could find others, but if you see something, please send me a note. I'd love to see what you get out of that. What about examples to learn from? Oh yeah, there's plenty. There's the example of Israel and his showing favoritism, and that's something we can learn from, even if it's from a negative aspect. There's the sin of the brothers, their jealousy, um, their hatred, their, you know, those are things that we can learn from. Um, and, you know, perhaps even Joseph, when he told those dreams, you know, was he a little, I had a dream that I'm going to rule over you, you know? Hey, you don't want to be arrogant, right? Um, humility is always a good thing. So maybe he brought some of this on himself. Um, but there's plenty of examples here to learn from. What about commands to obey? I don't see a command given here. What about things to be thankful for? Well, thankful that Joseph wasn't killed. Thankful that God had a plan. God worked out His plan. And as we look in the chapters that come after this, we'll see God's plan working out. And God can use even a terrible situation like this for His glory and our good. And so that's something to be thankful for. That's all I have for today. Hope you have a blessed day and hope you have a great week. We will see you again tomorrow.